I have watched 4 seasons of a show in the last 36 hours in a fit of procrastination. But here we are. Basically, I want to cover everything we know about wrong loads. A rather niche bug that occurs when someone over at Bungie decided, hey, maybe we can save some time by only turning off part of a load trigger rather than the whole thing when we want to deactivate it. It's not remarkably useful, but can make a small handful of routes easier or more interesting. To cover all of how this bug works though, there's a lot that needs to be understood first. So to form an itinerary for this video, first of all we need to cover load triggers, both the enabled and disabled kind. And then after that we'll go a bit more into how the area around load triggers are theorized to work. And after that we'll cover how the actual mechanism of wrong loads works. After that I'll show some small quirks that can occur with it, and then finally I'll cover how to use it in conjunction with another glitch to be used in a much more powerful way. Destiny's maps are huge, with lots of complicated things going on throughout the game world. It would be more than unreasonable to have the entirety of each patrol space and mission all be loaded in all at once. So the game's worlds are broken up into chunks referred to as loads. Crossing between loads is intended to be a smooth experience that's hard to notice for your average player. But sometimes you might have seen something like a loading symbol pop up when walking through a pathway or down a hallway, and that's you hitting a so-called load trigger, an area that tells the game to unload the place you just were, and instead show you the new space you're going to. Definitely could fill another entire video on their own, but as far as is needed in this video, they basically have 2 relevant states: enabled and disabled. Enabled load triggers would function as you'd expect, calmly taking you from one space to another seamlessly, while disabled load triggers are really only used when Bungie wants to keep the player out of a specific location. We've only got a handful of examples of loads being disabled, and they've only been used on 2 planets at the time of writing this script, Savathun's Throne World and the Dreaming City. On Savathun's Throne World, in Patrol, the load into Disciples Bog from Miasma is disabled. And when in the raid, every load out of Miasma aside from the one to Disciples Bog is disabled, basically forcing you to either be in the raid or in Patrol, but never both. Dreaming City has a similar situation where the loads from the Last Wish into Rhea Sylvia, the Strand, and the Blind Well are disabled, including the ones out of the offshoots from the Confluence as well. But all other loads work in any instance of the Dreaming City. Now, if you approach one of these disabled load triggers normally, nothing happens. More nothing than usual. The load trigger that should take you somewhere never triggers, and you can just walk right up to the edge of the world. And that basically sums up disabled loads. Next up on the list is covering how the areas around load triggers work, because they're surprisingly more complicated than just player goes in one side and comes out the other. Let's say you were in the Dreaming City, and you wanted to go into Bay of Drowned Wishes. As you start to approach the load, you cross an invisible barrier that begins to store important data about Bay. This is so that your game load syncs smoothly and seamlessly when you finally do hit the load trigger. I don't know what all or how much is stored by this, but I have on rare occasions noticed a small stutter in my game when I approach these regions, so I can concretely express that it's more than 0. From here on, when a player has entered one of these preload spaces and has the data stored, I'll show it with an icon in the corner of the video for easier understanding. Now let's say that as you approach the load you change your mind, and decide you want to go to the Strand instead, so you turn around and start heading back that way. Now, at this point you have a bunch of junk data that you don't need anymore. And as you cross into a new, larger, invisible threshold, the game unloads all of this data for Bay. That way you can store the new data for the Strand or wherever else it is that you might be going. And I need to express, these unload regions seem to be pretty large. It's hard to perfectly map something like this, but we know they exist and we know that they're huge. And every load trigger's so-called unload region is capable of unloading any other load trigger's data, making mapping them out an absolute nightmare. Now we can actually get into covering wrong loads. We've got all the pieces for the puzzle, we just have to put them together. Let's imagine, for just a moment, what could potentially happen if you get preload data for a region and skip the unload volume, so that you can keep that preload data. Some of the more tech-savvy of you might imagine things like memory leaks or overflow errors or crashes. And yes, crashes are absolutely possible, but most of the time it's more mundane than that. What you end up with is a pointer telling the game, hey, I'm trying to go to this place, and nowhere to apply it to. Or at least, that would be the case unless you found somewhere else you could apply it. Like a disabled load, because a disabled load is effectively a load trigger with no pointer. So to finally put it together, what you can do in game is as follows. Step 1. Set spawns close to a disabled load. Step 2. Approach the load that you actually want to go into, without setting any spawns. You can avoid setting spawns by avoiding touching the ground for any more than like a second or so. Step 3. Die while close to the load trigger to the load you're trying to enter. Step 4. Respawn near the disabled load, effectively skipping the unload threshold, and keeping the data for the load you want to go into. And finally, Step 5. Hit the disabled load. Now, for some reason, hitting a load like this kills you in the process, but once you respawn, you'll be able to explore the new region you just got into. Now, I'll be the first to admit that this isn't super useful on its own, but has been a powerful tool when used in conjunction with some other glitches to achieve much more complicated goals, like getting 6 Guardians into Queen's Court, or getting a solo Guardian into Ragnarok Abyss from Last Wish. Next up, I wanted to go over a couple of small quirks about wrong loads. One has been a massive inconvenience, the other has been quite a bit more useful. First off, wrong loads can absolutely crash your game. And although we don't know why, we do know that whether or not you crash is entirely up to how you hit the disabled load. Things like angle of entry, frame rate, and even player speed can have an effect on it. So if you find yourself crashing a lot, try to change one or more of those variables and sooner or later you'll have some luck with it. Second off, the more useful feature is that if you die while leaving a load, even if it's a fizzle death like dying to the load trigger itself, the load you're leaving's preload data is stored in the player. This quirk I call wrong load preservation. This quirk of it I'll definitely show off in a second video on this topic, but right now it's a bit above the scope of the current video. Now, to put wrong loads together in a route, I'll show off one of my earliest contributions to the Destiny Out of Bounds community. The Ragnarok Abyss Wrong Load IRB. First off, we load into Last Wish, listen to the ramblings about Riven, and immediately get into the route. Going through this hole to the side of the door in Devalian, we can make our way around and behind the hallway. Climb up above the load into Blind Well and run around to make sure we set plenty of spawns. Next, we can make our way over towards Bay of Drowned Wishes, making sure not to set any spawns at all. As we approach the load and die, we've now gotten all of the preload data that we need. After that, we can die again, this time setting our IRB point to a location that's solid out of map from Bay of Drowned Wishes. I plan to cover IRBs in a future video, but for now you can just trust that they're awkward black magic from Bungie, trademark pending. Once we respawn, we can drop down below the load trigger to the Blind Well, hit the load in a way that doesn't crash, and get our ghost outside of map from Bay of Drowned Wishes, successfully doing our wrong load and also setting our ghost up for an IRB. After that, we have our teammate trigger an auto-res we're using for the IRB, and are sufficiently out of map in the Bay of Drowned Wishes load zone. And finally, we can make the long descent down to Ragnarok Abyss. I didn't plan on doing an epilogue for this video, but considering the fact that I didn't manage to cover quite everything I wanted to, I think I'm going to have to do a part 2 for this video. I'm pretty sure I even mentioned it earlier in the script. There's a lot of little idiosyncrasies about wrong loads, and there's still one more route that I really want to go into like quite deep detail about, that Froggy already has a video up on his channel. I'll link it down below. But his explanation of how it works is kind of fuzzy. He was in a rush when he made it and ended up having to bail, like, pretty much the next day to go on some sort of trip. Also, yeah, I don't actually remember what all I wanted to say in this. Screw it, video's over.